The Uber driver. Christine, a 38-year-old mother of four living in Pittsburgh, was driving for Uber on February 10, 2022. 22-year-old Calvin Crew used his girlfriend's phone to order an Uber, which Christine accepted. He uses his mask and hoodie to cover his face. He looks around to see if it's clear to make his move, and pulls a gun on Christine. She asked, "What are you doing?" He says it's a gun and keeps driving. Christine says, "Come on, man, I have a family, what are you doing?" He says, "Keep driving." He orders her to cancel the ride so it can't be tracked. He held her hostage and forced Christine to drive for an hour. Calvin took her phone and deposited all her money into his girlfriend's checking account. He told her everything will be okay as long as she listens. That would be a lie. 2 days later, Christine's body was found in the woods by an Amazon driver 50 feet off the road with a gunshot wound in her head. Calvin's crew was arrested thereafter, and prosecutors are pursuing the death penalty for him. The Good Samaritan. In the winter of 1975, a 22-year-old college student named Sotria Kritsonis was waiting at a bus stop to go to school when a car suddenly pulled up beside her. The man inside was very handsome and politely told her that he had just come from the opposite direction before asking if she wanted a ride. And since she had been waiting in the cold for almost an hour, she decided to get into his car. But soon after they took off, she realized that the man was headed in the complete opposite direction. Although she thought about jumping out of the car, she realized that there was no handle on the passenger side door. The man began yelling at her, telling her that she would never escape. But as Sotria sat there, sobbing, the man suddenly told her to take her hat off. She was confused by the request, but he just kept demanding for her to do it. When she did, his face suddenly changed. He pulled over and shoved her out the car. She later realized that the man had a preference for long brown hair, and he had stalked her before because she fit that type. But since she had recently gotten a haircut, she soon let it go, and became one of the few people to survive an encounter with Ted Bundy. The Witching Hour. A woman was away from home on a business trip. The night before she was supposed to board her plane, she had trouble sleeping and had this intense feeling that somebody was staring at her in her room. She was up until 3 a.m., tossing and turning until she started to hear whispers. It was a deep voice repeating the words, "I'm coming to get you." But she ignored it and eventually fell asleep. After her plane landed, she was exhausted but drove home anyway. About 30 minutes into her drive, she started hearing the same whispers from last night, but she thought it was because she was sleep deprived, so she kept driving. She started to feel sick. Her eyes were watering, her nose was running, and she let out a large sneeze. "Bless you," said the same deep, eerie voice. She pulled into the driveway, hugged her husband, and started to tell him what was going on. She told him, "I can still hear that voice." She looks past her husband and sees a shadowy figure seated in the back seat of her car. Movie mayhem. The gunman put his headphones in, turned his music up on his iPod, and readjusts his gas mask. He starts walking towards the theater and slips inside through the exit door. It's the midnight showing of the new Batman movie, and fans in the auditorium are glued to their seats. Suddenly, bright sparks and smoke engulfs the room, and everyone assumes it's a prank, probably just some guy throwing firecrackers. That's when they hear gunshots. People run and scream, some hide under their seats as a stream of bullets lights up the pitch-black room. As the shooting continues, hundreds of 911 calls are made. James Holmes is responsible for the Dark Knight Rises massacre. An unexpected Christmas. On Christmas Eve 2008, a young girl opens the door to see Santa Claus. But it appears there's something under his outfit. She assumes it is presents for her and the rest of her family, so she runs to give him a hug, but is instead shot in the face with a 9mm bullet. The man dressed as Santa, 45-year-old Bruce Pardo, proceeds to kill 9 of her family members and set the house on fire with a gift-wrapped flamethrower. Bruce's divorce had been finalized 1 week before the massacre, and the house he burned down was where his ex-wife and her family were celebrating Christmas. He had no criminal record and no past history of violence. Following the attack, Bruce drove to his brother's house and took his own life. The Visitors. In the 90s, a teenage girl claimed she saw shadowy figures that would crawl all around the room and grab at her legs. During this time, her health rapidly decreased, which led to her death. Doctors could never determine the cause of her death. Her sister then started hearing whistling sounds and saw a creature crawling around her room with no face. The same night, her mom was ripped out of bed by someone. Her father called the police. They searched the house and found nothing. As the officers get ready to leave, they hear something. Horrifying screams coming out of the bedroom. They run into the room, but there's no one in there. All they see is huge gashes on the wall that weren't there before. In the police report, the chief and the 3 other officers swear and see and hear the same as the family. No one could ever explain what led to these hauntings. The Gore Orphanage has a horrific history. Originally called the Light of Hope Orphanage, created by Johann Sprunger. The orphanage is located on Gore Road, which inspired the current name. Before this orphanage existed, Mr. and Mrs. Sprunger had a former orphanage that mysteriously burnt down in a fire, killing 3 girls. After this tragedy, the Sprungers simply moved to Ohio and started the infamous Gore Orphanage. Death seems to follow the Sprunger family wherever they go. They had 3 deaths at their first orphanage. Their 7-year-old daughter died, lost their son at birth, and 2 of their other businesses burnt down. On the property the orphanage was built on previously stood an abandoned mansion. Joseph Swift, previous owner of the mansion, had his own string of tragedies. First, his 5-year-old daughter died, his 24-year-old son died, and soon thereafter he lost all his money. This led to sale of the mansion to Nicholas Wilbur. The Gore Orphanage Part 2. Wilbur held rituals and seances and tried to speak with spirits of deceased children. In an instant, their 4 grandchildren all died of a sudden illness and were later buried on the land. Mrs. Wilbur went insane due to the deaths. It said she would set the table 3 times a day and pass food around as if they were still alive sitting there. The mansion was finally abandoned in 1901 due to many deaths and misfortune. Johann Sprunger built the orphanage, and almost immediately ghastly things started happening. The orphans would run away from the home, wading in the river trying to escape. The children were abused, neglected, and even pushed into slave labor. They were fed calves' lungs, hog heads, and sick cattle. Reportedly, corn was used to boil in the same pots as dirty underwear. They slept in rat-infested rooms, waking up to tiny bite marks throughout their bodies. Kids were only able to wash up once every 2 weeks, and they wouldn't change the water, which led to sickness among the orphans. Some of the children who passed away were just buried on the property. The Gore Orphanage Part 3. In 1909, an investigation was conducted. At the time, Ohio didn't have laws about conditions like this. Unfortunately, no charges were brought against the Sprungers even after they admitted to their wrongdoings. Johann Sprunger died 2 years after the completion of the investigation. By 1916, the Gore Orphanage closed due to financial troubles. The children were spread out through the community, either sent to relatives or given new homes. Many of the survivors didn't speak about their experiences at the orphanage. Many who come to visit the ruins of the orphanage have reported to see dusty fingerprints of small hands left on their cars. Perhaps the lost souls of the children did descend upon the infamous area where many of the living are known to go in search of the spirits of forgotten children.